Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. A pretty common question that I've heard is how many battleships did the United States Navy want to make? Now, we're not talking about how many ships were numbered and some got canceled and whatnot, like of the known numbered ones. But if congressional spending and authorization wasn't a thing, what was the United States looking for in a total fleet size? So, first of all, this question pre-assumes that it's happening before the Washington Naval Treaty, because that then limits the sizes of not only the U.S. Navy, but other navies. And all of those navies are limited to sizes smaller than they would like to be. But since there's parity, everybody let it happen. Freed from any sort of restrictions, though, just how big of a fleet did the United States want and think was capable? Well, the short answer, if you don't want to flip to the end of the video, was Admiral of the Navy's George Dewey himself, then the president of the General Board, first recommended a fleet of 48 battleships. Historians now believe that he arrived at that number a couple of different ways. Other recommendations at different times called for approximately 50 battleships, but 48 is the number that seems to be pretty commonly cited. And it seems like the only major reason for that, this plan starts in 1903, when the states of New Mexico and Arizona were working their way through their application process to go from territories to statehood. So it looked like the United States was about to have 48 states. Battleships are named after the states. So it seems like Dewey's whole plan was to have one battleship per state. Keep in mind, the United States stops building battleships prior to Alaska and Hawaii becoming states. And when the names Arizona and New Mexico are assigned, it is immediately after those territories have been granted statehood. So what are some other reasons why that number makes sense and is commonly referred to? Because surely there wasn't just every state wants their own battleship and we want as many battleships as states. That also worked out numerically that between 1903, when the plan is presented to Congress, and roughly 1919, 1920, when they expected to complete the plan, they could build that many battleships on top of the ones that they already had. Now, keep in mind, it takes 3 or 4 years to build a battleship, and there are a limited number of slipways to build a battleship on. Typically, a battleship will be on the slipway for approximately 2 years, and it's launched and completed. So you need to have enough slipways to be building 2 or 3 years worth of battleships that have been authorized. So Dewey was recommending that Congress authorize at least 2 battleships a year from 1903 to about 1919, 1920, so that the fleet would get up to 48 battleships. And then presumably, Congress would continue to authorize that many battleships so you could start to decommission the oldest and most obsolete ones and replace them with newer models. Keep in mind, in 1903, Dreadnought is still a twinkle in Jackie Fisher's eye, so they're specifically thinking about pre-Dreadnought type battleships. Although I've also heard this number still being thrown around during the World War I time period. Having 6 battleships or so under construction, especially given the private and public yards that were available, that's completely doable. In that time frame that was discussed, the U.S. could make that many battleships. Now, we're not just building battleships in a vacuum, so the decision that 48 battleships is the number we want is not just based on how many slipways and how many states. It's also based on how many battleships our perceived enemies are building. Keep in mind, this is the same time period that the United States is making the so-called rainbow war plans, the colored war plans for potential wars with a variety of future opponents. Black for Germany, orange for Japan, red for Great Britain. They were planning on potential wars with all of the other great naval powers and a lot of other minor powers as well. They would eventually get to the point where they were planning these war plans against multiple nations at once. So, the U.S. Navy is also beginning to throw around during this time period the concept of a two-ocean navy, which is finally realized during World War II when Congress passes the Two-Ocean Navy Act to build a bunch of ships. This is right around the same time period that the Panama Canal is being built. So the U.S. Navy is starting to think about having one fleet of ships that can transition from ocean to ocean. But the Panama Canal is still a fixed site that is vulnerable to enemy attack. And so ideally, and I've heard this two different ways, but ideally the Navy would have two fleets available. One fleet in the Atlantic, where Germany is the primary threat, one fleet in the Pacific, where Japan is the primary threat. The two ways I've heard this was that about 2/3 of the fleet would be in the Atlantic to face Germany and about 1/3 in the Pacific. But I've also heard it said they would be divided strictly 50-50. Additionally, if the United States, then the third largest navy in the world, had to fight the largest navy in the world, the Royal Navy, they could concentrate their entire battle fleet per Mahanian strategy into a single ocean and be able to match the Royal Navy pretty close to ship for ship. Or alternatively, keep their fleets operating in separate theaters because the Royal Navy is defending a colonial system that spans the globe. Another way the 48 battleships make sense is that during this time period, a battleship division is comprised of 4 ships. So essentially, you're talking about, let's say, 2 fleets comprised each of 6 divisions of battleships. So 12 total battleship divisions that could be deployed piecemeal in peacetime, but then massed as a single fleet or as a pair of fleets in wartime. But they didn't just offer recommendations on the number of battleships. They were hoping by 1920, in addition to those 48 battleships, to have a fleet of approximately 370 warships. It's interesting to me that this is significantly smaller than President Reagan's 600-ship Navy, way smaller than the fleet we actually attained during World War II, but still about 100 ships larger than our modern Navy. Based on available slipways, the plan was to build about half as many armored cruisers as pre-dreadnought type battleships. Armored cruisers being the forerunners of the battle cruisers. They can stand in the line of battle, they can project power overseas. They're like the fast wing of the battle squadron. And so that would give them a fleet of 24 of these armored cruisers. The armored cruisers originally started off being named after states, but as we started to build towards that 48 battleship goal, they had to rename a lot of the armored cruisers after large cities in those states to make the battleship names available. So ships like Pennsylvania and Tennessee that are later era dreadnoughts get their names from the armored cruisers. The U.S. Navy already had about a dozen of these between the Big Ten and the older New York and Brooklyn, and so they were just talking about doubling that number. One problem with the U.S. Navy during this time period was Congress was willing to fund all of the bling, but none of the basics. They would consistently authorize battleship construction, but less consistently escorting ships, scouting ships, and auxiliaries. So the Navy was hoping for at least as many scout cruisers as battleships, and at least as many torpedo boat destroyers, as they were then known in 1903, as scout cruisers or battleships. So they were looking for about 48 battleships, about 24 armored cruisers, about 48 scout cruisers, and then about 48 destroyers, or torpedo boat destroyers as they're known at that time. They grow into the destroyers, and keep in mind this is before the torpedo boat destroyers have an anti-submarine role. They are still just there to screen the fleet against enemy torpedo boats, which will also merge into the destroyer class. Likewise, the scout cruisers will grow into the light cruisers of the World War I and World War II time period, and they're doing exactly what their name is implying. They are going to be scouting ahead of the fleet, and they will also likely be forward deployed in peacetime in these colonial squadrons of cruisers that the major colonial powers like Germany, Great Britain, the United States, and France had deployed around the world. So that gets us to about 168 ships. That means of the other 370, some of those would be the brand new submarines that were coming online. Some of them would be the various colliers and other types of auxiliaries that would be supporting this fleet in their global power projection mission. So, what do you guys think? In an era when the battleship was utterly dominant, do you think it made sense to be shooting for a fleet that large? Or do you think, given the length of time it takes to build a fleet like that, it's absolutely insane to try and maintain that many ships in service at one time? Keep in mind, you're building about 2 a year, so your older battleships are going to be utterly obsolete by the time these newer ones are coming online. And so while you nominally have 48 battleships on paper, realistically, only half of that number is capable of standing up to an enemy fleet. And the other half is really just absorbing manpower that could be going to the Army or the more modern battleships. Do you think 48 was a reasonable number or completely unattainable? Keep in mind, by 1914, the United States does have 33 battleships and 12 armored cruisers, so they're only about 15 battleships and 12 armored cruisers away from this goal. They're significantly further away in scout cruisers, but those are much quicker to build. They need smaller slipways, so they're not taking up those capital ship slipways that the armored cruisers and pre-dreadnoughts or dreadnoughts and battle cruisers are taking up. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below for ways you can donate to support the museum. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about us and the channel. Thanks for watching.